want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for the fourth night in our fall reading, Word on the Street fall reading series. Before we begin tonight, the library would like to offer a traditional land acknowledgement that the Lethbridge Public Library acknowledges that we're gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future, while recognizing their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The city of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Tonight, we are joined by Kirsteen MacLeod. Kirsteen is the author of two books, In Praise of Retreat, which is a nonfiction memoir, and The Animal Game, a book of short stories. A native Glaswegian, she has also lived in Toronto and Brazil. Her prose and poetry have appeared in many literary journals, magazines, and anthologies, and her work has been a finalist for the CBC Literary Award for Creative Nonfiction and Art Poetry's 2020 Poem of the Year. Kirsteen divides her time between her home in Kingston, Ontario, and a riverside cabin in the North Woods. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Before we get started, my first question, I guess I'm going to ask you from your biography, what led you to Brazil?
My husband's Brazilian. Yes, we met in Toronto. So we ended up living down there for a little while. Yeah.
That'd be a fascinating place to live.
Yeah, it is. So I've got a bit of a triangle going on between Scotland, where I was born, Canada, where I grew up, and Brazil, where I've spent a lot of time and have family. Yeah.
Okay. So for those in our audience who haven't had a chance to read In Praise of Retreat yet, could you describe what the book is about?
Yes, that's a hard thing to do because it is a fairly digressive book. I've seen some reviews that did a better job than I do describing what's in the book. But maybe what I'll start out by saying is that it started out to be a smaller book. So I started out, there's an early chapter called Green Cathedral. And this chapter details how I ended up leaving Toronto and the discoveries I made at a small retreat cabin in the woods in northern Ontario near a city named called Bancroft, a northern city. So I had this experience where I just by serendipity ended up buying this little place in the country, and I started spending weekends there with my husband, and more we got interested in the more quiet and reflective and solitary side of life. So we were dyed-in-the-wool urbanites. We had absolutely no interest in going somewhere where there were potentially more biting bugs than people. It was complete serendipity that led us there, and it transformed our lives. So that was the beginning. We ended up moving to Kingston, which is a small city further down the lake from Toronto, a smaller place. And I really changed my life to start doing more literary writing and teaching yoga as opposed to, working in journalism and sometimes consulting. So it started out to be, I was going to write a book essentially about the cabin. All of it was going to be based on my retreat experiences and how it transformed my life. But the more that I started to look into it, the more I started to realize that there's a very, very deep historical roots in the idea of retreat. And the more I started to read about retreat traditions in the West and some in the East as well, the more I realized that what I really wanted to do was branch off from this initial essay about my transformative nature retreat and look at the whole history of retreat and what retreat has to offer to modern people. So that's when the scope really expanded quite a lot. And if I want to describe it briefly, what I ended up doing was a quick history almost of retreat in the West. So it began with the desert fathers and mothers who moved from Alexandria into the desert, the early Christians. And that tradition, it was hermits, monks, and pilgrims sort of grew out of the Christian traditions. So I called that the old ways, and many of those we still do today. So, there's a chapter about monasteries, and I think I call it monastics for moderns because it looks at the traditions and also how we might use those infrastructures to go and stay in beautiful natural places in these monasteries, whether it's religious retreat or secular retreat. Pilgrimage is obviously one of the main ways that we literally step away from everyday life. Being a hermit is a little more challenging. As I explained in the book, I spent some time in a hermitage in the north of Scotland. So that's the old ways. And then the next part of the book deals with what's retreats that are probably the more relatable today. So nature retreats based on the naturalists like Henry David Thoreau and Walden Pond going to, he's sort of the prototypical retreat. We go to a cabin in the woods, perhaps, and also art retreats. So retreat is something that's really institutionalized in the arts, and often in order to get the necessary solitude and deep concentration, many writers and artists and creative thinkers of all kinds require. So arts retreats is another part of that. And then more recently, the way we've been influenced in terms of our modern day retreats, the traditions of yoga and meditation and some of the Eastern traditions that have come actually to the West have really influenced and shaped how we retreat. So it basically covers those things, a nature essay about my transformative retreat that then looks more broadly at the old ways of retreat, what they have to offer us today, the newer ways, nature and art, and then also the newest ways that we retreat, study retreats usually for yoga and meditation. It's a very digressive book and covers broad territory.
It's really interesting. I think you did a wonderful job of sort of blending your own personal experiences along with what I imagine was a lot of research going into all these different retreat practices throughout sort of history, and even a lot of different literature and poetry into the book as well. It was really well done.
Mm-hmm.
How much time did it take to actually complete all that research? I imagine it took you quite some time.
Well, it's interesting. I was cursing my background as a journalist in a way, because I really do love history and I love the facts and I love those kinds of details. It would have been a much simpler book if I had just written the lyrical book, sort of following on from that initial essay. I had 3 years to write the book, and the last year was really intense. In fact, I didn't have any idea how long it would take me. And I was supposed to have finished it in March of the previous year. And luckily I didn't, because it would have come out the exact month of the pandemic. And as it was, the book ended up coming out, it would have come out. Yeah, it would have come out. So it ended up coming out after after the pandemic started. So it would have come out the March before, I think, and it ended up coming out in better time. So it was a lot of research, and the last year was really difficult. And I made it hard for myself in some ways, I must say. At one point I had a chapter that I called A Short History of Monasticism, which, as you can imagine, is not a very easy thing to summarize. So most of that ended up in the notes, because after taking so long to write it, I couldn't part with the information. So anyone who's interested in history will find a lot of things in the notes that actually came from that chapter that almost broke me. But yes, I managed it in 3 years.
So when you mentioned that when you're sort of first moved from Toronto to your cabin in the woods and sort of generally moved towards that, how scary was it to, like, I know it was something that you wanted to move away from Toronto to sort of an easier lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine going into that type of retreat is also a scary experience for someone as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be a real change of altitude, is the way that I think of it sometimes. So I didn't really realize it until, except in retrospect, that I had dipped my toes in the water of retreat before actually going to my cabin. So I'd experienced a meditation retreat, and it was a similar thing. I felt like I really just wanted a little more spaciousness. My life just felt so deadline driven. I was working as a journalist. I was living in downtown Toronto. Things were very speedy, and I just felt like I wanted more time for reflection. So on an impulse, I just found a retreat center called the Dharma Center of Canada, which is in Kinmount, Ontario, a 3.5-hour bus trip from Toronto, and I ended up going there. So sometimes I would go there just to be in a beautiful natural place in a nice conducive setting. They had a great library. There was meditation. I really enjoyed it, but I didn't stay very long. And I do remember walking down the path the first night I was there, because you'd have to walk for half an hour into the place where, the accommodations were. And I wasn't used to being in the woods. And I must have looked scared because somebody actually came up to me and assured me it was a good place and that the woods were safe. So I think my nervousness was probably apparent. So yeah, you're quite right. It can be a really different experience if you're used to being surrounded by people all the time and maybe in action all the time. And I like to think of it as being almost like sports or something, you know, like you don't just go and do a marathon right away. It can be good to dip your toes in these experiences and also to expect that things will arise. So perhaps you'll be fearful. Some people just feel really bored and like they need to leave. And in fact, sometimes people do leave, but maybe they'll experience something that will draw them back to try it again. You know, you might get a headache for a week, or you might feel like you just need to sleep for the whole time. I just consider that like settling. And once you get used to the altitude, it gets restful, and then it actually gets very enriching if you can kind of get through the initial turbulence.
All of us we all carry our cell phones around with us all the time now. Like I've got mine right here sitting beside me as we go here. How do you think technology has affected our ability to retreat?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And part of the reason that I wanted to write the expanded part of the book is because I've lived half of my life analog and half of my life digital. It just happens to be the age I am that I've really experienced what it was like before we had our cell phones and after. And I really think that when there are societal changes, that a lot of things get swept away and that we get amnesia really quickly about what some of the good things are that are getting swept away with the bad. So it's not like I'm against technology, because it's like, you know, fire, you know, you can use it to keep warm or it can burn your house down. So I think technology is a bit like that. And I mean, this technology, a lot of it is designed to be addictive, right? It's very distracting. A lot of studies are showing that we don't know the difference between what's new and what's important after a while. So I really do think, you know, in my experience, I find it a bit of, maybe because I did spend half of my life analog, I find it a bit of an assault on my senses. And I really benefit, you know, I find it kind of funny. Somebody younger than me, you know, who maybe it's a generational thing, said to me that there's things that you can get on your phone to stop you from getting messages and things if you're working and you want to concentrate. But I mean, something like that on a gadget is designed to be addictive just isn't enough for me to settle my headspace and just go back into myself and quieten down and connect with myself and maybe with the environment. So that's how a retreat can be really beneficial. I think that technology makes it even more important to really remember what it's like just to, you know, to be with yourself and not to be worrying about the absence of your technology or other people or things, to really be able to enter your own space and just let things settle and maybe start to see things in a different way. So you can't really see the big picture when you've got pings and phishing, you know, phishing attempts where they're trying to get you to buy things, or, you know, the technology we're seeing can be quite difficult. And a lot of it is there to harvest our information. And it's quite difficult to maintain equanimity, I would say. And so it makes it more difficult to retreat, because I think we are a bit hooked on our gadgets, and it can make us even more nervous when we don't have them. But I also think that it makes it more important to really make the conscious effort of will to just step away once in a while and, you know, let things clear.
Yeah, my wife and I, we try and keep the upstairs of our house technology free. Clock, that's it, no TV, no computers, and give you that sanctuary away from this constant bombardment from your phone and the internet all the time. You have a quote in your book from Mark Zuckerberg that privacy is no longer a social norm. I think it was a way for us to try and get back to that, where we have our private lives, because everything nowadays is, everyone puts everything out there on Facebook and Twitter, and I think it does a lot of harm to people, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like, unless we're in public, we're not alive or something. That's what it feels like sometimes. And I mean, I don't I don't really want to, I mean, a lot of people, I've noticed a lot of millennials, even though they have the reputation for being really attached to their gadgets and things, all the ones I know are actually really good about taking technology breaks and leaving their phone at home when they go for a walk. They seem very savvy about how to let go of that and kind of stop it from closing in. And but the thing is that it makes us very reactive, doesn't it? We're always in this reactive state where we're responding to things. We're always available. People have, their phone beside their bedside table, sometimes to use as their alarm. There was a study that I quoted in the book where young people were saying that if they were on if they had a choice of having their cell phone or having somebody to have sex with on a desert island, they would choose their cell phones. Right. So, I mean, it definitely has its dark side, technology. And I really think that we need to be conscious about making that effort of will. And that's where retreat comes in. So retreat is an ancient practice, but for modern people, I think one of the best things it has to offer is that just removal, a step back from society, from the reactiveness to get into a more responsive state again. Because when you retreat, you get a little bit of rest, you get some quiet time. If you retreat for long enough, you may get some insight into what's most important to you. And then you come back to your everyday life with a more set sense of purpose to guide you in your actions in the world. So it isn't meant to be, something that you do necessarily. I mean, a hermit maybe will decide to stay in retreat for forever, but just for regular modern people, it can just be a really good way to step out of it and let it all settle and just set your inner compass and become more purposeful in what you're doing with your life and what's really important, right? Like that's something we need to keep our focus on, is what's really important to us. Because if you just follow the stream of all the modern technology, you could just be down your rabbit hole, for days and days, just researching things. Like one day for this book, I wanted to know if hermits really wore hair shirts. I think I was thinking that's a weird thing. Like hermits, do they really wear hair shirts? So I looked into it, and like 3 hours later, I'd read all these things about hermits and hair shirts. Like I didn't really need to do all of that, right? So we just have to be aware, I think, of these pitfalls that it can pull us into. And we get really reactive. Like you might find when you go on a retreat, perhaps without your phone. Many retreat centers, funnily, actually have wireless now. If you go to a yoga retreat or a meditation retreat, there's often wireless. That tells you how the world has gone, right? But it's important. I think we've become forgetful about the important. We understand the social and the active side of life. But I think we've become really forgetful in our times about the more solitary and receptive side. And it's half of our reality. And it's really important, even more so in the modern age where we're being barraged by technology and information.
So you mentioned hermits. Do you think it's possible for somebody to actually become a hermit in the world today, to actually retreat from society in that form?
Well, that was one of my big challenges, was to find a place where I could experience even a taste of being a hermit, and perhaps do some research about hermits as I experienced that. So I spent one winter looking around to see what I could find, and you'd be surprised how many hermits there actually are, like people living as hermits. And hermits, even in the old days, in the early days, they used to work. So they would weave reed baskets in exchange for food or things like that. So I found lots of hermits, actual Christian hermits, who were teaching calligraphy, maybe online, offering online services for things like that, and still living as hermits. Some of them just in a flat in England, where they didn't really come out often. So there were a lot of those. There were a lot of Americans. There's a newsletter called Raven's Bread, and it refers to the two old hermits, St. Anthony and St. Paul. And when they were talking in the biblical times, there was a raven that came and brought them food. So they named their newsletter after these two old hermits who were friends, and they have like 2,000 subscribers or something like that, people who I actually identify as hermits. But none of the things were really what I was interested in, because I wanted to be in an environment and a geography where there had been a history of hermits. So what I ended up finding was a book that actually I found really inspiring, one of the most inspiring books for my book. It's called The Book of Silence, and it's by a woman named Sarah Maitland. And Sarah Maitland is a self-styled hermit. So she's been living in a little cottage in the south of Scotland for about 20 years, just in the moors, you know, really empty place, living a really simple life there. And she wrote this Book of Silence because she really loved silence, and she couldn't understand why. You know, we all say that we value independence, but everybody's afraid to be alone. And she would complain that, you know, if she said that she was going to go on a round the world sailing trip by herself, everybody would say, wonderful, that's fantastic that you're doing that. What a great adventure. But when she would tell people that she was going to retreat to be a hermit for a while, people thought she'd lost her mind. So anyway, she writes a book all about her experiences. For 40 days and 40 nights, she goes to this place in the north of Scotland and writes about her experiences. It's a wonderful book. So as I was hunting around, I came across her. And after her book came out, she got a lot of letters from people saying, how can I experience being a hermit? Because obviously there aren't a lot of vacation rentals that cater to hermits. It's not really an easy thing to find, a place that's removed enough, but is set up for hermits. So she ended up taking over the lease of this small cottage in the north of Scotland. And so I went to stay there, and I write about it in the book. So this place is available either for rent, or I think if people don't have the means, she will actually just lend them the place. And yeah, and so she said it's been mainly writers and Buddhist and Christian meditators who have stayed there in the past. And there's a guest book there where people have written about their experiences, and it's just in a really remote spot. There's a place in the northwest of Scotland called the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, and the end of it is the most westerly part of Scotland. And so it's on this remote peninsula, and it's a little stone cottage. So it takes some doing, I guess. That's a long way of saying it, but it is possible to have a taste of being a hermit in the modern world. And in places with good climates, I often would find people who maybe lived in New Zealand. There's a hermit named Pete who's quite famous. He's been like interviewed by the press because in the olden days, St. Anthony's followers used to chase him into the desert. So he would try to retreat, but his followers kept chasing him. So he locked himself in a tomb at one point, and the followers broke in. And so then he retreated further into the desert. And that's how the first monastery started, because everybody kept following him. So in the modern day, I would say the press are probably a proxy for curious people. And there are lots of interviews with hermits. Some of them are like official hermits living in the Swiss Alps that got jobs in caves. You know, like they had actually want ads, and these people filled the ads. And yeah, I've run into a great variety of people. You know, like there's possibilities for people like me who just wanted a taste of hermit life. And there's actually possibilities for professional hermits to get jobs in Swiss caves and everything in between. I would say being a hermit is one of the harder ones, and probably one of the ones that most people don't feel as drawn to as probably some of the other ones in the book.
So why do you think there's such negative connotations about people wanting to be alone? Like when you mentioned that people act like, oh, you're crazy for wanting to go and live this way. What do you think about society that makes us think that way?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started doing the research, I realized I feel like there's a pendulum that swings throughout history. And sometimes it swings towards the social and active being the best way to have a good life. And sometimes it swings more towards the solitary and receptive being the way to a good life. And right now, I feel like it's swung hard over to the social and active side. And, you know, this was one of the things that I really wanted to explore in the book as well. I couldn't really understand it either. I liked Sarah's question, like, why is it that we think we're independent people and we value that, but we can't be by ourselves?
Right.
And I thought, well, to me, like a mature person, should be able to have both options. And I just couldn't understand why it has to be either or, because I think balance is important. So I think it's really good to have skills in both of those sides. So I think it's partially just that historical thing, it's shifted, but it's really odd. I still find it quite puzzling. But a lot of people have reservations because they think that it's escapism. Whereas for me, what I think is taking a step back to connect with what's most important to you, what you love the most, and what gives your life meaning, kind of comes before action, and it is action. So that's the way I see that. I don't see it as an either or thing. I think that, there's lots of examples through history of brave new ideas and wisdom coming from the retreats of everyone from religious leaders to artists. There's historical figures all the way through. So it's part of a wisdom tradition. So self-knowledge. And then, after the 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, new wisdom is brought back to the collective. So I don't really understand that one either. And there's this whole connotation with, weird loner, you don't want to be thought of as a weird loner. So the best answer I could come up with about what it was about was partly it's almost like we're a bit illiterate, like we don't retreat, we don't step back into solitude on our own, so we don't really know how to do it, so we're not good at it, and we find it nerve-wracking, so we don't really understand what it has to offer us. I think is part of it. But I also think there's a confusion with the idea of solitude and some of the things like loneliness and isolation and alienation. So I kind of think of loneliness as solitude with issues. So solitude is kind of being, just deeply immersed in your own doings, and not feeling the absence of others, but feeling the presence of yourself, right? So it's actually a really glorious state. And Marianne Moore, the poet, she said the cure for loneliness is solitude, which I think is really true. So, and I looked at some psychologists who tried to define what's the difference between, loneliness and some of the negative aspects of being alone and solitude. And they said that one of the main things is that it's voluntary. So if you step back into solitude, maybe on a retreat, but that you can leave anytime and be back in society and community and company, then that's a totally different feeling than if you're stuck on a deserted island or you're imprisoned or something. So that was actually not, at first I thought that maybe I would talk about that in the book as well, but then I realized that that's a really big distinction, right? So when I'm talking about retreat, I'm talking about a voluntary step back for some purpose of your own, whether it's just to experience what it's like, to take a step back into solitude and receptivity, or whether it's to rest, or whether it's to heal. A lot of, grieving can be helpful sometimes to step back. And these are skills that really help you at times where you have to surrender to what comes to you in life. So I wrote this book before the pandemic, but many people are telling me that they're finding it helpful almost as a guidebook to how to, instead of run away from being alone and feeling bad about it, to actually start to enjoy it and see it as a rich dimension that maybe we haven't really explored or realized was there, or at least that was the case for me. I had no idea, right? It was just not part of my experience until that transformative retreat at my cabin really showed me this whole side of life I didn't know was there. So,
So I've seen, I think you mentioned it briefly in your book, and you see in the media and stuff that some people they almost look down on some people that decide to go on retreat. They sort of treat it as being self-indulgent and almost as a form of weakness. What would you do to those people?
Well, I mean, this is kind of cheeky, okay?
All right. Cheeky is fine.
So I kind of think of it like this, right? Okay, so you've got a Rembrandt painting, and some people you're going to show it to, and they're going to love it immediately. And then some people with a bit of education are really going to like it a lot, right? And then there's just going to be some people who just don't like it and aren't interested and can't relate to it. So I just think it's a bit like that. Like maybe retreat is not for absolutely everyone. A lot of the research I found in the book shows that it can be beneficial for all of us, because it gives us a lot of life skills, basically. But I just think, I have friends who say if I went on a retreat, I'd unravel. And we don't want them to unravel, So, and I do go on a big exploration in the book about whether it's a thing that appeals more to introverts. It definitely appeals more to people at certain times of life than others. So it's not for everyone all the time, but there are particular times in life it can be very helpful. And many people, like me, I was totally uninterested, but it was when I was 40 that I had this experience of, leaving the city more and being in nature. So I think that the second half of life is actually a time that many people, even who have absolutely no interest previous to that in spending much time in solitude or, exploring the inner life, start to find it more compelling. And it really is compelling. I think of it as being like an adventure. So it has as many peaks and valleys and interesting adventures as, adventures in the external world. So that was a big surprise for me to find out that, the inner life is actually filled with adventures as well. And once you start to get a taste of that, it can be really fascinating. So I make a joke in the book that doesn't sound as funny, given that I wrote the book before the pandemic, but there's one part where I'm joking around and just saying, I wish I could institute conscription so that everybody has to try a retreat, just so that they can start to recognize some of the benefits. Because I think that most people would recognize the benefits if they had that exposure. It doesn't sound as nice now that we've had our forced pause. Well, some of us anyway have had a forced pause with the pandemic. But I have heard from a lot of people who are saying that, if they hadn't had to stay home from work and really change their life, they wouldn't have discovered some of the things that they've been reading about in the book and finding that they are really enjoying it. I've heard from quite a number of people from a broad spectrum of backgrounds and things that, the book has helped them a bit see the pandemic has some brighter sides. So, Pascal said, in difficult times, always keep something beautiful in your mind. And the book talks a lot about spirit and art and nature as being things that really sustain us and give us solace. Yeah, so it's been kind of an interesting journey in that way.
So do you think with the state of the world, with the pandemic and everything, do you think that retreat has become more important than ever for people to have that ability?
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's all a matter of scale. So in the book, I'm talking about like literally kind of taking yourself off somewhere to get out of your regular habits, to get out of your everyday routines, and just to have a different kind of experience. So whether you do it as a hermit, in the north of Scotland to try to experience that, or whether you go somewhere where there's actually an infrastructure that is set up for you. So I also went to Le Monastère, which is a former convent in Quebec that's set up as a wellness retreat. And, they've set it up so that you can go and stay in the former nuns' cells, which have been upgraded a little bit. But it's a very beautiful place with a very serene atmosphere. There are monasteries all over the place. I guess St. Peter's is a really beautiful place in Saskatchewan, right? So there are lots of places that you can go and take advantage of the foundation that's been laid there by some of the Christian retreaters. And so I guess what I'm talking about is that step back to a place. So a retreat is two things, right? It's a noun, which is a place, and it usually relates to the natural world, a beautiful place that we go. Like our first retreat places as humans were sacred rivers and holy mountains and so on. And then we started building retreats in these beautiful places. So those are all available to us. But the whole point of what ends up happening when you take yourself away like that, that can be really helpful to take yourself away, just to have that, to let go of the habits. But ultimately, the goal is to take that inside. So some people are unable to really physically retreat. Like I've heard of virtual pilgrimages, for people who can't necessarily walk a pilgrimage. So taking yourself off somewhere out of your habits is great, but ultimately it's a state of mind and heart. So I would say for people, retreating is one of the few things you can do. You can actually rent a place and go there like yourself or with your family. Right now, that is something that some people have the ability to do. But if you can't, I've talked to lots of people. I have a friend who's a meditator, and she has designated her garden shed and fitted it out as a retreat. I know someone else who's recovering from COVID who basically can just go out into their little square of grass, out the back. I know some people who visit a certain tree every day, as their place of retreat. So I think it has become more important. I feel like some sanctuary, the reason for the subtitle of my book, Finding Sanctuary in the Modern World, I feel like the inner sanctuary is being kind of assailed and that it's really important to draw back. And I also feel like the environment, right? Like the planet that's our sanctuary. The earth is our sanctuary. And I'm very interested in the correspondences between inner landscapes and outer landscapes. So really at heart, my book is a kind of at heart, it's a bit of a call for a certain kind of inaction. So a step back to preserve the inner sanctuary and connect with it, which provides bigger picture thinking. So when you retreat, certain things tend to arise. And if you retreat enough, it's like anything, you progress. So it might start as a rest, then it might be insight, then you might start to see the way that things are interconnected. And I just really think that far from being a self-indulgent thing, I think it's really essential at the moment because things are very out of balance in our world. So inner world, outer world, right, are a reflection of one another. So I don't want to overstate it because a retreat can just be for the experience of experiencing emptiness, which I find really quite exciting, just to experience a retreat to see what happens is an adventure to me. It doesn't have to have goals. But what ends up happening if you keep doing it as almost like a practice is that it starts to lead to you making these connections. So you start to realize, me, the Torontonian who wasn't really interested in the natural world at all, looking around and realizing, I'm part of this web and I am nature, and, seeing the ways that we're interconnected. And that really changes the way that you act in the world. And I really think that we need some of those brave new ideas and some of the wisdom that has always been associated with retreats in the world today. So I really think this inner adventure is not an escape. It's something that can engender wisdom and really guide you with purpose through your days. And the way things are right now, I think, it's going to really require motivation and courage and resilience. And if you connect to what you love, Mary Oliver, the poet, she said this great line, attention is the beginning of devotion, is one of her lines. So I really believe that's true. Stepping back to pay attention is the beginning of devotion. And we may need to give up some things in order to make it right. And I think if you realize your connection and your part in the natural world, for instance, then you may willingly give up many things. Human beings with purpose will willingly give up many things to make it right. So, I mean, that's as a deep practice, but I think it's really useful, right from everything from experiencing what it's like not to be in the social and active realm if you're not used to that, all the way to these greater things that I think are really important to help with some of the dysfunctional things in the modern world and some of the life diminishing things that I feel like are just getting swept away in the stream of difficulties. And
we have a question from one of our audience members, and I should also mention to our audience, if you do have a question for Kirsteen, a Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen. You just click on, type in your question, and I can read it out. But we have a question from Caroline. She says that she really enjoyed your book, and she was wondering how the pandemic affected your own retreat and how it will impact it in the future.
Oh, thanks, Carolyn. That's a great question. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, like part of the story of Green Cathedral that I tell the initial chapter of the book is about how when you've got a sanctuary, the nature of a sanctuary is that it can be violated. So I talk a little bit about some of the difficulties that I've experienced, you know, with having the place to ourselves totally for 10 years and then suddenly having neighbors and having to get used to that. Well, it seems like every 10 years something happens up there, and there has been a lot more pressure, I think, on the land during the pandemic. So I started having some issues with the neighbors for the first time. Some of them are hunters, and they just seem to be much more present and kind of encroaching on our property. And so there's a lot more pressure on the land. So that made it a bit difficult. I think people were really under pressure, and it's great that everyone's turning to nature in order to find solace and connect to the natural world. And that's a really beautiful thing. But yeah, the pressure on the land, I've definitely noticed. And but things are actually going to turn out to be really wonderful. I just feel like there's so much difficulty and so much good in the air right now. And we have to cross, I described how we have to cross over, go a mile down a logging road to get to our place. So you go down a mile down the logging road, there's a creek, and then our place is on the other side. So all this land has been owned by logging companies. There's a vast tract of like 700,000 acres or something like that that is part of where I cross over. And a naturalist who is a billionaire, I think, has just bought this huge tract of land. So in terms of the pandemic and my retreats, I noticed there was a lot of pressure, and now that just seems to be relieved. It's like one of the best things that's happened to me in my life. This whole tract of land, not our place because we're on the other side of the creek, but part of it has been given to the Nature Conservancy Trust of Canada. And there's a 3-phase process. And I think this man who is going to be giving it all. So no longer will these lands be logged. They're going to be preserved for future generations. So I got to say, like, you know, I don't know if that's really what you're expecting me to say, but I just think it's a very interesting time. There's pressure on the land, but there's these really good things happening as well. So I just feel like I feel like in a way, the pandemic and the pressures have made people realize how important it is, how important the natural world is and our environment. And maybe, you know, this attention is leading to devotion. So I'm feeling very joyous to have this place. But at the same time, I've really come to realize through my retreats that, you know, it really has to become a place of mind and heart, because whatever we are attached to, whether it's our retreat place or a person, we can't hang on to any of that. So that's the really important lesson of retreat for me. I try to let the changes wash over me a little bit and do the best I can, excuse me, to look out and care for the place that I am, wherever it is, whether it's up there or my home in Kingston or wherever I am, and really take that inside. So yeah, I'm feeling optimistic and just really feeling like I'm learning to deal with those cross currents of some of the difficulties and people with different ideas about how the land should be used, and some of these really good forces that are coming in that go along with our recognition of the importance of the natural world that perhaps has been increased through the pandemic.
Throughout your book, you described a lot of the different retreats that you've gone on throughout your past. And do you have a favorite one that you've gone on that maybe it was more meaningful than the others?
Yeah, it's interesting. One retreat through the whole book. So my friends were really, they would ask me and laugh and say, how's your pilgrimage going? Because it was like, I was doomed. For the whole time that I was writing this book, I tried to do a walking pilgrimage. And I started to think that it was because like I kept failing. Things would happen and it just wouldn't end up being what it was that I was after. So a pilgrimage I counted as a retreat just because it is the main way that modern people tend to really like to step away literally from everyday life and experience something else. And the embodiment, I think, is really important because in the modern world, we're getting more and more urban. We're getting more and more attached to our screens. I just love the idea of an embodied walk. So I tried so many different things and it would fail every time. So one time I found a really nice pilgrimage I was going to go on and they were resurfacing the whole road, so I couldn't walk on it. I found a great pilgrimage that went from Concordia University to Kanawake, which would have been really wonderful, right? An Indigenous reserve that's there. And they had a really good pilgrimage program and cultural exchange. They weren't doing it for the first time that summer. So I had all these failures. And finally, I decided that I was going to walk in one of my most beloved geographies, which is north of my cabin, so Northern Ontario. And there's an old railway line that goes quite far. So I decided I was going to do my walking pilgrimage there. Oh, I tried a pilgrimage in Brazil and it ended up that it was a pilgrimage to a shrine and not a walking pilgrimage. So many, many things went wrong. So I'm just about to set out on my pilgrimage and a fox jumped over the fence of the cemetery that I border on and killed a couple of my chickens. It was like this giant tragedy, you know, and I just thought, oh my God, like what next, right? So anyway, I finally made it there. And on the way, I was taking a cab from Bancroft to the trailhead in a place called Maynooth. I was going to walk down from Maynooth to Bancroft. And the cab driver told me that the bear hunters were angry because the bears were really well fed. I guess there was a lot of fruit and berries for them to eat, so they weren't taking the bear hunters' bait. Yeah. And that's when I realized I forgot to bring bear spray.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, so anyway, so it felt like, you know, like I just thought if I managed to do this without something going wrong, it's just going to be amazing. But it ended up being really fantastic. A lot of the land that I was traveling through was one of the railways that had been put there by settlers, and a lot of the resources had been taken out by that same route, taken south. And so now the railway's gone and it's a rail bed that you can walk quite far on called the Hastings Heritage Trail. A lot of it goes through land that is actually part of a large Algonquin land claim. So it was just very interesting, you know, to be thinking about my Scottish heritage and, you know, the people displaced in Scotland from the Highland clearances, many of them coming here and then displacing the people here from their lands. And it was just a really beautiful experience just to walk in this land that I feel really connected to and just think about how I just found it really a good thing to think about, like just thinking about my relationship to here as I was walking that path and walking through these areas that are part of the land claim and, you know, finding these apple trees that when the railway was there, I think people had just tossed their apples out the window. And there's these, you know, there's apples that are known to be from Quebec growing along this trail. So I think that pilgrimage actually was really beautiful. And it was weird because it's not a good place to go for a pilgrimage. I didn't run into any bears, but it's more of an ATV trail. So I would regularly be like leaping off the trail so that the ATVers wouldn't run me over. And but yeah, that was one of my favorites. And so I did manage to actually complete the walk and wore out a pair of shoes. And
interesting that you mentioned that as your favorite because I think it really came through in your writing that had meant to you and it was so well described and that along with how important your cabin is to you. Mm-hmm. Descriptions were just, it takes you right to there. You can just picture it in your mind. So for our listeners who are maybe considering going on a retreat of some sort, what type of resources are there out there to sort of research where they might go or things they could do?
Yeah, there's all kinds of things out there. I ended up reading so many, you know, online websites and going through, you know, various places. So it really depends what you're interested in. So I would say, you know, right now, most of us are sticking close to home, I guess. So I would say that if you want to experience contemplative life, but it's kind of more organized for you, then looking for either a monastic setting. So St. Peter's in Munster actually is a place that I think accepts people, because a lot of the Benedictine monasteries, they understand that it's not just religious people that need to retreat, but that everybody can benefit from retreat. So they often welcome people to stay there. So you can be there perhaps in silence during the day and eat meals and things. So that can be, then it's all set up for you to experience, and you don't really have to organize things yourself. I would really suggest that as a good possibility. If you're interested in yoga and meditation, there's all kinds of retreat places that you can go, or if you don't want to go somewhere, there's a lot of retreats online. So people have been, doing things where you do a retreat for the weekend, but you're home for dinner sort of thing. So it's not like taking yourself out of your space, but it definitely is taking yourself out of what you habitually do in your space. Those are a couple of ideas. Renting a cabin in the woods or borrowing one from friends. A lot of yoga and meditation places actually accept what they call karma yogis. So you can work for instead of paying, or there's bursaries or things like that. So yeah, and it doesn't even need to be as involved as that though. Like I said, my friend just designated her garden shed as her retreat, and she would go there for that, or arranging your own walk. So I tried so hard to find a pilgrimage, and I just felt like I wasn't a pilgrimage person. And the reason was because I wasn't interested in doing a set pilgrimage for some reason. I just had a bad attitude about it. So eventually when I invented my own pilgrimage, it was really satisfying. So I would really, if there's a place that you really like to spend time and a walk is your style, then, like one of the things I would have liked to do where they were repaving the road, I had an idea to go visit this really old tree, a really ancient tree. I was going to do a pilgrimage to that tree and then write about the tree. But because they were resurfacing the road, that didn't work. So, I mean, choose a retreat place like in the old style, like we used to do at the beginning of time, a holy mountain or a sacred river or an old tree or something that you like, and just do that as a mindful practice. There's lots of beautiful things that you can either imagine or do some searches and look up Raven's Bread and the hermits in the United States. Sometimes they have some good information on there about things you can do. Yeah, so one of the things I like to say is there are more retreat spaces than you might imagine. So I always like the retreaters in the ancient times used to be on the edges of society. That's where they were. And still, if you look to the edges, you can usually find little corners where you can get some peace. And there was this architect, and one of his projects in Spain was he needed a studio and he didn't have one. So he built underneath a bridge. There's a high side and a low side. So on the high side, he built a little studio, and then he built a little thing to winch himself across from the low side. So at the low side, he would get on the platform and he'd winch himself across, and he wouldn't tell where it was for obviously reasons. But he said the highway gave just the right amount of white noise, and he found it as a really beautiful place, artistic space. And artists are doing like residencies in container ships and all kinds of places. So yeah, there's literally, when you start to think about it, there are endless possibilities for you to take yourself off on a retreat, whether it's, for an hour, or if you possibly can for at least a weekend would be good.
In the book, you describe going on retreat as sort of learning to drive. Do you think it's possible for people to jump into it too quickly, or is it something that you should sort of ease yourself into?
Well, I think it really depends on the person, but for the most part, I would say like exercise some caution, like really, radical retreaters, they train for it like it's the Olympics or something. So if, for example, if you're in a monastery and you want to be a hermit, like you have to live monastic life for a long time, and they're going to make, and your teachers are going to make sure that you're ready for trying to be a hermit. So because it can be very difficult. So that's very extreme. But even me, I was really scared the first time I went to the Dharma Center, walking down that path and thinking I'm in this weird environment and what's going on here. And, depending on what's going on for you, like I said, you can get I got headaches sometimes. I slept for a week once when I went somewhere. Another time, like I was just too agitated and I couldn't stay and I ended up leaving. I think it's really important to be really kind to yourself. All of us have different starting capabilities for solitude and receptivity, but yeah, I would say like start small and see how you find it, you know, and it takes a little bit of doing to find the thing that works for you. So yeah, I'm always trying to decide if I like a writing retreat where I can do yoga on my own, or a yoga retreat where I can do the writing on my own. You know, like I can never kind of figure out which is the absolutely perfect place for me. So yeah, it can take some doing. And some people like to retreat more in community, right? I would suggest that is a better place to start, perhaps, to be with like-minded people, so that you can kind of get used to the different options. So if you're in silence, you know, that can be very strange for people at first. The first time that I spent 3 days in silence, I really felt like talking. So, so know that it's going to be very different than everyday life, but that's the great thing about it. Yeah, I would say, you know, to go carefully with it. Slow immersion is better than plunging in. I've read quite a few things about people who have done Vipassana retreats and just thought like, you know, there's one story that I read about this woman who she felt like she said she needed to defrag her hard drive, was the way she put it. She was just too like jumpy and agitated and busy. And so she decided she was going to do this very intense, I think it was 2 weeks or a month retreat, yoga retreat. And one of her friends said, "What are you doing to yourself? Like, that's like doing a marathon when you've never done anything, you've never run." And she did have a really difficult experience. She said in retrospect, it was one of the better experiences of her life. It was really grounding for her in a really deep way. But yeah, there's ways of doing it where maybe you won't have such a bad month in order to get that. Don't try to run a marathon if you have no experience running, I would say.
We're quickly running out of time here, so I thought I would ask you, do you have any upcoming projects that you're working on for writing that you can tell us about? Or
Yeah, so as you might guess, after my big research monument, because I did end up doing a lot of research and working really hard on this book, I've also been working on poetry for about the last 15 years. And so I'm kind of immersing myself in poetry and wondering if I have perhaps, you know, how much of a manuscript I have. And it's kind of a beautiful segue. So I spent a lot of time researching and writing and adventuring and going all over the place and pulling together and synthesizing all these ideas. And now I'm taking a little time to really focus deeply on language and, you know, without the same kind of considerations that you need for narrative. So it feels very freeing at the moment to be working on poetry. Yeah, so that's probably going to be my next project. But I do have a couple of spin-off projects I'm probably going to get to, things that didn't make it into the book that were really interesting. So, so I'm sure there'll be more to come on similar themes that I couldn't quite fit in here.
It gives us something to look forward to. I think that's one of the dangers of being a writer is you have these little sort of tangents that you can sort of will spin off into their own little world and their own books. And yeah,
absolutely. So it's really funny. I'm trying to work only on poetry and just, you know, immerse myself in that for a while, and really pay attention to language and, you know, the sonic qualities of poetry and reading a lot of poets and things. But at the same time, I have a multitasking brain. So it's almost like those old CD players, you know, they'd have 6 CDs in them and then you'd change, it would spin and you'd be on a different one. I feel like I have about like 6 other projects that are spinning in the background that I'm trying not to look at the moment. So
well, it looks like we've hit 8 o'clock. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's been talking to you. A lot of good information for our audience and for everyone. I just want to mention that in Praise of Retreat, I've got a copy right here. It is available through the Lethbridge Public Library, or if you'd like to purchase your own copy or partner for booksellers for our events is the University of Lethbridge Bookstore. So they do have a link on their website where you can purchase Kirsteen's book. We will be meeting again 2 weeks from tonight on November 4th, where we'll be hosting Terry Fallis. We're moving to the fiction side of literature now, and he'll be talking about his newest book, Operation Angus. But again, thank you, Kirsteen. We've got some comments coming in through the Q&A. Thank you that your talk was so interesting. So with that being said, I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your engaged questions, and thank you all for coming. Take care.
Goodbye, everyone.